the waste management sector of the 2013 Scoping Plan update. My name is Howard Levinson. I'm Deputy Director at CalRecycle, and I just want to give you a couple of logistic pieces of information. Most of you have been here before. You know restrooms are around, out the door and around to the left, cafeteria downstairs, and if we do have a fire drill, follow the runners out the door, and they will take you quickly down the stairs and out to our designated evacuation site, which is across the street at Cesar Chavez Plaza. With that, you'll be hearing from me later, but I want to take this opportunity to introduce two people, Carol Mortensen, Director of CalRecycle, and Edie Chang, Deputy Executive Officer of the Air Resources Board, who will give you some introductory remarks about today's workshop. And I think we'll turn to Carol first.
Thank you, Howard. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming. Really excited to have you all here today to talk about a lot of hard work that's been going on the last couple months and actually the last couple years on our joint effort with ARB on the waste sector and what impact it can have on the reduction for GHG emissions in California. So last week, as many of you know, the ARB hosted their first workshop on the 2013 Scoping Plan update, and it covers 6 sectors: energy, transportation, ag, water, natural lands, and waste. Yes! Very, very, very excited about that. As you know, ones that know me, I've always thought that our sector really has a great impact on GHG reductions in the state that are fairly easy to get to and very quantifiable and very doable. So I'm very excited to have us so promptly in the scoping plan. So we're going to co-host this workshop today and delve into more detail to the waste sector portion in the scoping plan update. Also, selfishly, the success of this plan is dependent upon CalRecycle making progress toward our 75% recycling goals. In this future, the one that we will rely primarily on recycling and composting to manage our waste streams, and where landfilling is an ultimate last resort that will ultimately deliver the GHG benefits called for in this plan. It's the upstream benefits of the using secondary materials and the use of renewable fuels and energy derived from our waste streams that provide the bulk of the GHG benefits from the waste sector. So the work on this sector addresses multiple mandates for both the ARB and CalRecycle. It will update the 2008 scoping plan. It is part of the implementing resolutions adopted by the ARB in 2011, and it's a key part in moving towards AB 31's new 75% statewide recycling goal. And one of the key messages that you'll hear today, one that many others have been articulating for the last few years, is that achieving the 75% recycling goal and reducing GHG emissions within California means that we'll need to develop a new recycling infrastructure for manufacturing, composting, and anaerobic digestion within the state. While it's daunting, it will result in many more jobs and many co-benefits, and also includes addressing our work toward helping disadvantaged communities. The work on the sector will yield environmental benefits beyond GHGs and recycling in areas such as renewable energy, agricultural soil health, water, and transportation fuels. As you'll see today, the ARB and CalRecycle have done a lot of work together over the past few months, and I can't say enough about the cooperative nature of our work together. I want to thank the ARB staff, the core team of Dan and Robert and May, and many, many others. Thank you very much. And my great staff, which is my core team of Dr. Howie and Brenda, Clark, and Terry. I said Dr. Howie, didn't I? I'm sorry. A little bit colloquial. You guys know him.
I didn't know that one.
Yeah. Sorry. Okay, today we want to present the draft work we've done so far and then open up to comment. In addition to ARB's overall overview paper last Friday, we released an updated overview and 5 additional draft technical papers with one more on procurement to come, and a draft implementation plan. We realized this was only a few days ago, so we want to introduce this material to you and then continue the discussion over the next couple months. So with that, I want to thank you very much for coming. Listen carefully. Please give us your feedbacks and comments. We're very, very excited about this. And with that, I'll turn it over to Edie.
Thank you. So I also want to thank everyone for being here today. Appreciate your interest in this topic. And as Carol mentioned, I think there's a great synergy between the goals of CalRecycle and the climate change goals that are articulated in AB 32. And as you know, ARB is the state agency charged with pulling together all of our plans on how we're going to implement AB 32. I think the other piece of it that this warms my heart is that this is a workshop that's co-hosted by ARB and CalRecycle, and I think it really is a testament to the incredible amount of work and cooperation that we've had over the last couple of years working together as agencies. One of the things that we're trying to do in the scoping plan is look at different sectors, but look across agencies and look for places that agencies need to work together better to try to achieve their common objectives. And I think this is a real example of what we're hoping other state agencies and other realms can be able to do to get together and talk about how we all move together to meet all of our environmental goals and all of the goals that we have for the state moving forward into the future. So I think that that's something that, you know, we've really appreciated all the hard work that the staffs have been able to do together, and it's something that we really want to continue and have spread throughout the rest of state government as part of the implementation of the scoping plan. As Carol mentioned, today we're really here to discuss the staff's initial ideas in some of these areas about how to meet both the waste and the climate goals, so some of the challenges as well as some potential pathways to address those challenges. We really want to hear your comments and suggestions. This really is sort of a beginning of the process, and so we're excited and glad that you're all here to participate. So thank you again, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Howard to begin the workshop. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Carol and Edie. And I think, you know, without their support and the full support of everyone in CalRecycle exec staff and ARB management and exec, this wouldn't be happening today. So it is really a testimony to work that we've done over the last few years. We'll see. Okay. So what we're going to do today, we're going to have the, see if I can get this to work. Okay, you're going to have to advance it, guys. You guys have to do it. We need about 2 hours of training for executive staff on mouse control. Predator control is part of another sector, though. And, there we go. So the agenda today is going to be, we're going to give an overview. Dan and I are going to give you a brief overview of the waste sector, similar to what was presented last week at the June 13th ARB workshop. And then we're going to go and have presentations on the various background papers by the folks who are up at the dais here. Those will be roughly 5 minutes a piece, might be a little more, might be a little less. And that is really to give you a flavor of what's in the those technical papers. We realize those were only released on Friday. Many of you probably haven't had a chance to look at them. So this is just a first real shot at explaining what's in the papers. Solicit your opinions today and comments, and those discussions will continue over time over the next couple of months. And then we will, hopefully that will take about 45 minutes or so, maybe a little more. And the rest of the afternoon will be devoted to hearing your comments to where we can clarify something or have some initial response. We might be able to do that, but mostly we want to hear from you in terms of what's good about what's being presented today, what's missing, and the like. And then we'll wrap up with some next steps. For those of you who are listening in, if you want to provide comments today, use the email address on the slide that's before you right now, which is climatechange@calrecycle.ca.gov. And we will wrap the session up and indicate that we want to have written comments from folks by July 12th, so we'll repeat that later on in the presentation. Next slide, please. So the scope of the plan encompasses a lot of different things. You all know how complicated the waste sector is. This listing of bullets here really reflects the papers that we've written and that have been distributed to you over the last couple of days. So we're going to talk about, more or less in this order, kind of recycling, reuse, and remanufacturing, state procurement, and then composting and anaerobic digestion. Those are more or less things at the top of the traditional AB 939 waste management hierarchy. We've separated out composting and anaerobic digestion because 1/3 of the materials that go into landfills are compostable types of materials, and that's what's generating methane at landfills, which is a concern to both ARB and CalRecycle. And then we're going to follow with short presentations on biomass conversion and thermal technologies. We've separated out biomass conversion because it's got its own statutory provisions, and this is sort of wood waste and related materials that go to cogen plants and similar facilities. So it's a little different topical area than thermal technologies such as mass burn incineration and gasification and pyrolysis. But we realize they're related. And then we'll finish off talking about landfilling, and then finally just a little bit about the draft implementation matrix. That's also one of the papers that was released. Next slide, please. Carol already said this, so I won't repeat it other than just to say that this work does address multiple mandates for both the ARB and CalRecycle. It's also tied to lots of other state policy drivers, environmental policy drivers such as renewable energy, alternate transportation fuels, agricultural soil health, and a whole suite of other policy drivers. Next. And indeed, we have a lot of interconnections with the other sectors that are part of the scoping plan. As Carol and Edie mentioned, water, energy, transportation, ag, and natural resources. And again, a lot of the connections concern organic materials because of their prevalence in landfills and in some of the alternate uses for organic materials and the co-benefits that accrue from such use. We've had a historical collaboration with many state agencies, obviously with the ARB over the last couple of years. We've been pretty much joined at the hip on some of this. But we've also, next slide please, have a lot of connections and historical work with other state agencies, including the Energy Commission, California Department of Food and Agriculture, and so on down this list. And that's just a partial list. We work with many other agencies. And so you'll see issues embedded in these papers that cross over into those agencies, jurisdictions, and purviews. And we have had briefings with them. We've had ongoing activities with them on many, many subjects that may come up in the papers or that you may bring up later in discussion. Next one, please. So the waste sector plan, as we presented it last week at the Air Board hearing, generally the overall vision is for Californians to take more ownership of waste that's generated in California, and that speaks to both individuals and how they purchase products and generate waste, as well as to producers and manufacturers and what kind of role they play in green design and end-of-life management of those materials. We clearly want to maximize recycling from landfills and build an infrastructure, as Carol mentioned, that can handle the materials that we remove from landfills and be built on a sustainable, low-carbon basis. And then not last, but last on this list, but not last in the hierarchy, is to reduce the volume of waste generated, which goes back up to taking ownership of the waste that is generated. Next, please. So for 2020, remember this is being put forth as part of the 2013 scoping plan update. So we're talking about goals relative to greenhouse gas reductions for 2020 all the way through 2050. And so we have kind of short-term, what's happening in the next few years, as well as long-term goals to be looking forward to. So for 2020, our goals for the waste sector relative to the scoping plan and greenhouse gas emissions are really predicated on AB 341's mandate to achieve a statewide reduction, reuse, recycling goal and composting of 75% by 2020. That's going to mean that we either have to reduce generation or remove materials amounting to about 22, 23 million tons per year that are currently going into landfills, and instead either not generate those in the first place or move them into more productive uses like composting or recycling manufacturing. If we do that, we estimate that in total, and I know we'll get questions about this later, but that can achieve 20 to 30 million metric tons of carbon dioxide emission reductions compared to business as usual. That's because of displacement of the fossil fuel use in extracting and processing virgin materials, as well as avoided landfill emissions avoided methane emissions at landfills in the future. One of the key considerations for us is that we don't feel that technology development is a real barrier. For the most part, we feel that technologies are available to handle these materials, but technology deployment is a problem. And we'll talk more about some of the challenges for deploying some of these technologies and practices as we move through the day. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dan Donahue, my colleague at the Air Resources Board, to finish up this first section of the overview, and then we will move into presentations on the individual papers.
Thank you, Howard. A lot of what Howard's talked about right now, is really covered in the overview. And what the overview tried to do is to take a look at all the information we were gathering from the various reports and come up with kind of an overall outline of what are the key pieces of information and how might we move forward. With respect to the 2020 goals, let's go to the next slide. To achieve the 2020 goal, there's a number of additional things that we need to do. Certainly, some of the efforts that we started to make in 2008 are carrying over with respect to 2020. Some of those things that were developed then and worked upon included the early action measure for landfill regulations. CalRecycle put together a mandatory commercial recycling regulation. As part of the overall process in looking at commercial recycling, there were a number of additional emission reduction factors developed which are critical for assessing what are the greenhouse gas emission reductions avoided when you use these alternative technologies. There's been at least one additional low carbon fuel standard pathway for the high solids aerobic that's been developed. There's additional work being done with respect to the low carbon fuel standard on another pathway. We have been working on extended producer responsibilities with respect to carpet and paints, and on this overall thing, we have some measurements coming up in the 2015-16 timeframe to see where we're at with respect to implementing a lot of the provisions of the original scoping plan and looking at the goals established in 341. Next slide, please. The other aspect of this, particularly with respect to the overall scoping plan that this feeds into, is looking at longer-term goals with respect to greenhouse gas reductions in the midterm and long-term time frame on that. And as you'll see in the other sectors, most of the other sectors have really focused on 2020 and beyond. Whereas this sector, because so much of the background work has started trying to meet a 2020 goal, and that we're not looking at substantially new technologies here, that we also have a lot of front-end focus on what's happening between now and 2020, because what efforts we make in pre-2020 are really going to set up the pathway for where do we go, certainly to meet the 2035 goal, and in some extent the 2050 goals. The 2035 goal that we're looking at, that we've proposed, is a net zero, and basically that means we would be looking at what are the direct GHG emissions from the various technologies and the various ways we process waste. We'd look at the avoided greenhouse gas emissions associated with businesses as usual, and direct minus avoided equals zero. So that right now is what we're identifying as a 2035 goal. With respect to the 2050 goal, right now what we've proposed is to look at further reduction of the direct GHG emissions, and right now what we're proposing is at least a 25% reduction from the direct GHG emission reductions that we're at in 2035. So those are farther out goals. As I tell everybody, that the 2050 goal, I'm probably either compost or ash at that point in time. So I'm having a harder time figuring out on that goal, but they told me to work on it, so we're doing that. Okay, next slide. I'd like to skip this one and go to the next slide. I want to confuse everybody and move back. Okay, so I actually wanted to cover slide 12 before before slide 11. And Howard covered a little bit of this, but this is really the overall focus of what we all had been looking at is how do we the focus of the plan is how do we reduce the waste generated, and there's all sorts of issues and challenges associated with that, but that's one of the key things. Secondly is how are we going to increase the recycling and establish and get the material to the most beneficial use. Get this material that we've traditionally called waste to and handle it more as a resource rather than as a waste. The third thing is how do we create the markets that are going to be necessary such that the waste that the materials that we're recycling, reusing, and remanufacturing have a place to go that can sustain those types of operations. And then the fourth one on the focus would be what role should thermal processes, biomass play in the overall beneficial use of waste materials. Now going back to 11, looking at the challenges, there's going to be a number of challenges in meeting that. We've talked a little bit about how important it's going to be for all of us to take responsibility with respect to the waste we generated, and to actually be treating this as a resource rather than a waste. We're certainly going to need to build new infrastructure, and that means we're going to have to address the economic issues associated with building new infrastructure. How do we address the cost differential between landfilling and some of these other options, and also address the siting and permitting challenges that are associated with siting new or expanding existing infrastructure facilities. We're gonna need to develop and grow markets for recycled, remanufactured materials. We're gonna need to figure out the role of direct regulation and with respect to waste sector sources, and to what extent cap and trade fits into this overall program. And we're also going to need to figure out how to track and measure the progress that we're making, and that's important in developing emission reduction factors on that, but it's also important in trying to identify where we're at in the process, because to make additional mid-course corrections that we need to achieve in the first place the 341 goals, and then longer term the GHG goals. Now I'll jump to slide 13 now. Wanted to just kind of give you an overview of some of the potential implementation mechanisms and actions that you'll see interspersed throughout all the papers. I mean, things that we're looking at is how to provide financial incentives. There's there's a number of opportunities that we need to look at and more fully address with respect to that. That includes leveraging cap and trade funding. I mentioned we're going to need to look at direct regulation from ARB, whether that is when and if that's necessary. And we're also going to have to look at particularly how the landfill and the energy sector may or may not fit into the cap and trade program, whether we can make progress under 341, and to what extent these need to backstop those efforts in that area. Next slide. Just continuation of some potential actions there. Looking at things like additional low carbon fuel standard pathways, remove the barriers, biogas injection in the common carrier pipeline. There's been a fair amount of work done with respect to AB 1900 on that. Additional funding sources, and certainly leveraging state procurement to increase markets. Slide 15, you know, again, looking at some additional potential activities or actions that we can look at, all the way from developing performance standards for the material recovery facilities to looking at considerations of expanding RPS eligibility and some of the other things listed there on the slide. The next slide, we should have one in between there. Do we have an implementation matrix slide between there? Oh, it's at the end. Okay, we moved that one. Okay. Just with respect to the next steps, you know, overall, certainly getting input with respect to the technical paper and the draft implementation matrix. As Howard mentioned, we're looking at having written comments by the July 12th timeframe. And certainly these comments will be, you know, are going to be critical to informing how we go forward with respect to the overall waste sector plan. Will be part and parcel to the scoping, the 2013 scoping plan update, and the January 2014 CalRecycle update to the legislature on AB 341. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it back to Howard, I think. Okay.
Thanks, Dan. So now we're going to move into some short presentations on each of the papers. I think the folks up here, you have your choice. You can stay where you're seated or you can come up to the podium, whichever you're more comfortable at. But we'll start with Clark Williams will be talking about recycling, reuse, and remanufacturing. We'd like to get through all of these presentations first, and then we'll go back and we'll open it up for a total discussion on any topic that you wish to speak about. Clark, go ahead.
Thanks, Howard. So the recycling, reuse, and remanufacturing technical paper focuses on the challenges and potential solutions to achieve greenhouse gas emission reductions through increased reuse, recycling, and remanufacturing of recyclable materials. It's important to emphasize that waste reduction, including reuse and recycling, are the top of the waste management hierarchy and are the preferred approach to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the waste sector. Next slide, Terry. In 2010, about 73 million tons of waste materials were generated in California. Roughly 37 million tons were landfilled, and about 36 million tons were recycled. The 37 million tons landfilled includes disposal-related activities such as alternative daily cover, alternative intermediate cover, and beneficial reuse at landfills, material transformed at California transformation facilities, and tire-derived fuel. There are a variety of types of facilities where recycled materials are sorted, consolidated, and prepared for end-use markets. According to information collected through CalRecycle's Facility Information Toolbox, we have adequate capacity in our current processing infrastructure to accommodate a significant increase in recycling. Once recycled materials are collected, sorted, or processed, they are delivered to recycling, remanufacturing markets, either in California or to export markets. California's remanufacturing facilities currently handle about 2.3 million tons of material with limited remaining capacity available. About 22 million tons of recyclable commodities are exported. International markets have been a needed outlet for recycled commodities over the past 2 decades. But they're subject to certain global uncertainties. This was illustrated during the 2008 economic downturn when we experienced a drop-off in demand for recyclable commodities, decline in commodity prices, and stockpiling of recyclable commodities at ports and material recovery facilities. Our dependence on foreign markets has been illustrated again this year with China's green fence policy that has adversely impacted export markets for recyclable commodities and really re-emphasize the need to develop new in-state remanufacturing capacity. There's not adequate remanufacturing infrastructure in California to handle the 22 million tons of recyclable materials currently being exported from the state, nor the additional 22 million tons of recyclable materials we will need to pull out of the landfill waste stream by 2020 to meet our 341 75% recycling goal. Dan and Howard covered these goals in their opening remarks, so I'll just reiterate that we anticipate realizing significant greenhouse gas emission reductions by achieving our 75% recycling goal in 2020, and anticipate additional reductions from the waste sector out through 2050. There are a number of challenges to increase recycling, including lack of sufficient domestic infrastructure to remanufacture recycled materials, insufficient markets for recycled materials, and the relatively low cost of landfilling, which adversely impacts the economics of recycling. Some specific challenges include a limited number of emission reduction factors for materials that can be recycled. Carpet's an example of this, and what that really does is limit our ability to quantify potential emission reduction. Markets for recycled and remanufactured commodities are not well developed. They're not stable and not adequate to accommodate what is needed to reach our waste reduction goals. There's also a decreasing quality of collected materials due to a trend towards mixed collection of recyclable materials. We have a number of potential solutions that's laid out in the technical paper. Additional recycling and remanufacturing capacity in state is critical for us to meet the greenhouse gas emission reductions and recycling goals, while also increasing our ownership of waste generated in California. We've listed here some potential solutions to the challenges, including they cover a broad range of topics, including permitting, incentives, markets, and regulations. A few specific potential solutions include development of programmatic environmental impact reports and associated guidance documents to assist project proponents in navigating the environmental review and CEQA compliance process, exploration of potential offset project protocols for recycling in order to access new potential revenue streams such as AB 32 offset credits, establishment of incentive payments or grant programs for remanufacturing of high greenhouse gas commodities. These could perhaps be funded through the use of cap and trade revenues. Another solution is to maximize the recovery of recyclable commodities by establishing grants, incentive payments, and or performance standards for MRFs and C&D facilities to recover mixed waste streams. One of the key potential solutions is really to reduce the volume of waste generated. There's a host of strategies that could be used to get at this minimizing waste generated, including green design, education, maximizing the recovery of packaging materials, and increased utilization of producer responsibility approaches, especially for hard to manage materials. I'd now like to turn it over to Kathy Freevert, who's going to walk through some slides that cover state procurement.
Thank you, Clark.
Hang on a sec, Kathy.
Okay.
We have some emails that people can't hear, so speak very closely to the microphone. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, we'll do so. As you might imagine, the state of California and its many agencies and departments purchase billions of dollars of goods and services. State government and all its employees who make purchasing decisions are therefore in a position to choose the goods and services that reduce our impact on the environment. So how does purchasing a recycled product make an impact on greenhouse gas emissions? Through life cycle studies, we have a clear understanding of the impacts of various stages of the product life cycle. From these studies, we have learned that many impacts associated with greenhouse gas emissions occur in the early phases, in particular, raw material harvesting or extraction. So much so that a recycled content product, even when considering the transportation and processing associated with recycling, provides reduced greenhouse gas emissions as compared to the virgin counterpart product. So while there are exceptions, this primarily holds true. Consequently, our purchasing decisions impact greenhouse gas emissions and the carbon footprint of state operations. This is not to say these are the only environmental considerations. There are others too. For example, a recycled product must perform well, or it becomes waste, and that works against our goals. It also must not have other significant environmental and health impacts, and that is why careful consideration using available information is needed. So overall, there is a significant opportunity to select products that advance both AB 32 and AB 341 objectives. And understanding how to tap into these opportunities is our challenge. Next slide. Okay. Oh, it's right over there. I'm sorry. So let's start and consider the data on state purchasing. And this slide shows two sources of data that we have. The state contract procurement registration system, called SCIPRS, shows that there is a total of $14 billion in state goods and services for the year 2012. And another program that tracks expenditures is a state agency Buy Recycled campaign program known as SABRAC. Under SABRAC, each state agency must ensure that 50% of reportable purchases in 11 product categories are recycled products, and they report this annually. In the 11 categories are a mixture of broad material types such as plastic, paper, metals, and it also includes specific products such as tires, paint, and compost. And as shown here on the slide, the amount expenditures reported through SABRAC is $185 million. Next slide. This graphic representation of the SCIPRS data highlights that expenditures of services are much greater than for goods. About 10% of expenditures in 2012 were identified as goods. However, this percentage is probably much higher since services expenditures often include the purchase of goods within the service contract and subcontracts, and services account for 90% of the total expenditures. For example, you can imagine legal services as requiring the use of paper, or painting services as requiring the use of paint. Our understanding is that up to 40% of service contracts may be spent on goods, and this percentage is higher with some state agency delegated contracts. In other words, if one could identify the goods that are part of service contracts, the blue wedge on the screen representing goods would be much larger, but we don't know how much larger. Another interesting consideration is how the SABRAC expenditures would show up on this chart. SABRAC at $185 million would be a sliver of the existing blue wedge. So it appears that expenditures of recycled content product and the potential greenhouse gas reductions associated with those purchases could probably be much larger. And the next slide shows some potential focus areas. The SABRAC statute, the program is about 25 years old, and the governing statutes have not been revised since 2005. The role of state contractors, while the contractors are required to use recycled products to the extent that's economically feasible, they're not required to meet the same purchasing standards or requirements as state agencies, and that includes reporting of purchases. Many state agencies have delegated purchasing authority under which they have discretion to purchase on their own behalf. And it is not clear if these delegated decisions adhere to SABRAC requirements or not. While DGS and CalRecycle have made major strides in recent years in promoting the purchase of EPP and recycled content products, there are gaps in the available purchasing data that make it difficult to determine which products and purchasing agencies to focus on that would result in reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and increased procurement of recycled content products. In addition, a tracking system is needed to record product information and certification of recycled content so state agencies can verify product attributes. And finally, in some cases, the recycled content products may cost more than virgin, and in these cases, many employees are unaware that the recycled content products may still be purchased. For example, a statute directs state agencies in the legislature to purchase fewer of the more costly products and apply those cost savings, if any, gained from buying other recycled products towards the purchase of those more costly ones. And with respect to next steps, as mentioned earlier, this is one paper that hasn't been released yet, but we are working with DGS on the draft procurement paper on these topics, which will be released shortly. So despite many unknowns, it's clear that there is significant potential opportunities for state agency purchasing to play a necessary and critical role in achieving state greenhouse gas and waste reduction goals. And now I will pass the microphone over to Kyle.
Thank you, Kathy. Speak right into this. Can you hear me? Okay. My name's Kyle Pogue, and I'm representing the organics team today to introduce you to the compost and AD anaerobic digestion technical paper. I think I'd like to start with an overview of the current organics processing infrastructure that highlights compost and anaerobic digestion, but also includes some other processing technologies as well. As mentioned earlier, we dispose about 37 million tons of waste per year in California, and about a third of that is compostable organic material, which includes primarily food waste, green waste, soiled, non-recyclable paper, and some other organic materials. Currently, the organics processing infrastructure includes over 130 compost facilities, processing roughly 5.8 million tons of material. We have 5 AD facilities currently processing about 0.14 million tons of material, with more of those on the way. This also includes about 160 chip and grind facilities as well. That includes processing of about 3.6 million tons per year. And then also, as Paul's going to discuss next, there are 22 biomass facilities with processing about 1.5 million tons per year. With over, resulting in over 10 million tons of organics processing annually in California. And I just want to point out that basically we need to double this infrastructure in California if we're going to achieve, or when we're going to achieve, our diversion goals and GHG reduction goals. Next slide, please. I'm going to highlight a few of the GHG benefits of compost and AD. And basically using organic material as feedstock for composting and AD can result in significant reduction of GHG emissions. And we get to this through avoided landfill emissions, displacement of fossil fuels with biogas, reductions in fertilizer and water use. You can see in Table 2 in the technical document kind of lays out the GHG emission benefits from diverting organics. And we could realize between 3 and 3.75 million metric tons of GHG emission reductions when we divert 50% of the material. If we move that up to 75%, that we could realize between 4.5 and 5.6 million metric tons of emission reductions. I do want to point out that these are ranges, and these ranges are they're reflecting or basically putting out there that some of these emission reduction factors are still under development and need some further work. So that's something that we're working on currently. So let's move on to next slide, please. And I'm going to highlight a few of the challenges to meeting some of the short-term goals. There are more goals laid out. I'm just going to highlight a few. There are a number of short-term challenges to meeting the 2020 emission reduction and waste reduction goals. One, I think we need to do a better job quantifying direct and avoided emissions from compost and AD facilities. Let's see. As I mentioned earlier, we need to double our current infrastructure and also be able to permit the facilities of the future. Facilities are currently competitors with low-cost landfilling, and that's a significant issue. And we need to develop markets for compost and digested residuals. For example, getting out there into the ag sector a little bit more would be helpful. Next slide, please. Some potential solutions to these challenges. One would be to revise the compost emission reduction factor to include avoided landfill emissions. I do want to point out that many of these solutions are identified in the waste sector implementation plan that I believe Howard's going to talk about towards the end. We also need to continue to work with other regulatory agencies to address conflicts in permitting and regulations. And I do want to highlight one current effort that's going on with the Water Board on a compost general order for waste discharge requirements. I see some of the Water Board staff here today, and we appreciate that collaboration. A number of the stakeholders in that process are in this room too. We need to improve compost and AD economics by providing financial incentives to site facilities and use end products. Some ideas highlighted there are organics grants or loans to compost facilities to improve their infrastructure or to AD facilities. Establish perhaps feed-in tariffs for electricity production. Establish GHG and criteria emission offsets. Those are a couple of key ideas there. Next slide, please. Some of the longer-term challenges include that we need to develop an infrastructure that can better handle the shift from landfilling to organics processing, basically from collection through processing. And we need to improve the quality of the compost and AD digestate, and we need to find ways to fund future research. Some of the solutions to get at those could include we need to do a better job of fostering state, local, and private cooperation in achieving the waste sector goals. And in the research arena, a few ideas are to better characterize the properties of digestate and find end uses for that material. And we need to research the newest best management practices for compost and AD and share that information. So at this point, I'm going to wrap it up and introduce Paul Milkey from the Air Resources Board, and I think you're the only one who gets to present two papers. So,
thank you, Kyle. Okay, next slide. Go ahead and next slide. Okay, so biomass conversion is the process of creating energy by burning materials of recent biological origin. And by that I mean not petroleum-based fuels. So the feedstocks that we're talking about here include wood waste from demolition, agricultural waste such as tree prunings and nutshells, and forest products such as sawmill waste or forest thinnings. And the table on this slide provides an estimate from the Energy Commission of the breakdown of the feedstock materials used by these facilities in California. And as you can see, each of these biomass types is used in fairly significant quantities, and many of the facilities use more than one of these types of feedstock materials. And there are many benefits to the conversion of biomass, including reducing the volume of material that's landfilled or open burned, reducing fire hazards, generating renewable power, creating jobs by producing in-state power, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions when you look at the benefits of displacing petroleum-based fuel, power that is. Okay. So a little bit about the facilities that are in operation in California. According to 2011 information from the California Biomass Collaborative, there are about 22 biomass conversion facilities in commercial operation in California. However, this number does change frequently, so this is probably already a little bit out of date. There are also a handful of facilities that are existing, but they're just not currently in operation. So in terms of the power generated by these facilities, it ranges from about 4 to 50 megawatts at each facility. And overall, they supply about 2% of California's electricity demand, which is about 19% of in-state renewable power. Next slide. So biomass conversion facilities can play a role in both reducing greenhouse gas emissions and in reducing the volume of materials deposited in landfills. And these facilities can reduce greenhouse gas emissions in a couple of different ways. First, new facilities can process waste that would otherwise be sent to landfills or open burned. Second, these facilities result in net negative greenhouse gas emissions when considering that they displace fossil-based energy. They can also help meet renewable energy goals under California's Renewable Portfolio Standard. And the power generated by these facilities can also be an important component of the governor's Clean Energy Jobs Plan. Next slide. So biomass facilities do face a number of challenges in both the short term and the long term. And these are outlined on this slide and are also discussed in more detail in the technical paper. In the short term, permitting issues make it very difficult to construct new plants, and the financial numbers don't always pencil out favorably for an operator. There are also concerns that these facilities could potentially increase the market for forest wood waste, which could promote more intensive harvest practices, which could result in unanticipated environmental impacts. And longer term, to maximize the utilization of biomass, additional technical and financial support is needed, along with a stable supply of feedstock material. And this is particularly true for small rural communities. In addition, more work needs to be done regarding technology development, and beneficial uses need to be identified for the ash from these facilities. Okay. So here are some potential solutions to the challenges facing biomass facilities, and many of these are discussed also in the 2012 Bioenergy Action Plan. In the short term, streamlining and facilitation of permitting of facilities would be helpful. Providing financial assistance and removing barriers to the utilization of biomass are also identified as solutions. Longer term solutions include working to facilitate small community scale facilities, fostering development and commercialization of new technologies, and finding beneficial uses for the ash byproducts of the plants. And that concludes that segment. Okay, next, MSW. Okay, next slide. So now we're talking about the treatment of municipal solid waste using thermal technologies. And specifically, we're talking about a couple of different things: conventional combustion, which is also called waste to energy; gasification, where waste is heated at high temperatures in an oxygen deficient environment; and then combustion of municipal waste or a segment of municipal waste, such as tires, as a supplemental fuel to conventional petroleum-based fuels. So currently there are 3 conventional combustion systems operating in California. There's the Covanta Stanislaus plant at Crow's Landing, the City of Commerce Refuse to Energy plant, and the Long Beach surf facility. Of these 3 plants, only the Crow's Landing plant is able to generate renewable energy credits according to state law. We also have a few cement plants that use scrap tires and to a lesser degree dried sewage sludge as a fuel. And according to data reported to ARB, this is 1990 data, scrap tires account for about 7% of the total energy used by cement plants, and about less than 1% is the dried sewage sludge. Okay. So here are a couple of key considerations in the treatment of MSW by thermal technologies. First is the cap and trade program. These plants are currently regulated under the cap and trade regulation. However, ARB has proposed to temporarily exclude them until 2015 for further review of the best regulatory framework for them. How MSW plants are handled under cap and trade will affect their operations. MSW plant operators, for example, have expressed concern that they will be placed at a competitive disadvantage to landfills if they're covered under the program and landfills are not. Another consideration is front-end processing, which is the recycling of materials before they go to the plant. Recycling, as we've heard earlier, is generally the best option for materials that can be recycled from a greenhouse gas perspective and for other reasons. So it's important to ensure that policies are in place to incentivize the maximum feasible front-end processing. Okay. So these are some of the short-term challenges facing waste-to-energy plants. It's extremely difficult to permit these facilities in California. As mentioned earlier, only one of the 3 existing plants can generate renewable energy credits. There may be some concerns that waste-to-energy plants conflict with recycling goals. The cap and trade program could potentially increase costs if they're placed into the program and required to purchase credits. And finally, some of these facilities face an uncertain future when their contracts with utilities, which provide a price floor, expire. Okay. And the long-term challenges really point to the need for research into new thermal technologies that may have advantages over conventional combustion, as well as we've heard before, beneficial uses of the ash. We're talking about both the bottom ash and fly ash. So that, next slide, please. And so this slide lists some potential solutions, and quickly, so streamlining of the permitting process for new facilities, allowing all waste-to-energy plants to generate renewable energy credits, greater removal of recyclable materials prior to treatment, low interest rate loans to aid feasibility of new plants, and finally, funding of research for new technologies and beneficial uses of the ash. So that concludes this segment, so I'll move it over to Mike.
Thank you, Paul. My purpose here today is to give you a little brief overview of the landfill paper. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Real close to the microphone.
Yes, okay. There's approximately 370 landfills in California that